Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I want to thank SSI and the Homeland Security Network for the opportunity to present this webinar. Observation on Demand, or O2D, was formed 4 years ago when I went on a training mission to Israel with SSI. That experience was so life-changing and important to me, I decided to dedicate myself to the research and development of performance-centric training programs. In other words, I wanted to develop programs that would increase the skill craft or street craft, as well as being economical, and not just theory, but tactical, to increase observation and critical thinking skills for our first responders and the Homeland Security community. Now, many of the things that I observed on that trip impressed me with how the Israelis have adapted to dealing with the threat of terrorism. It is through the sharing of intelligence in real time to the military, law enforcement, security, and the private sector. It's their use of situational awareness and observation skills. They are masters at behavioral profiling, or for those who want to be politically correct, behavioral assessment. And it is also their ability to train and to continually train to improve themselves and their skills. Now, this tiny country has been under the threat of terrorism since its inception. But I see all people that are so well trained and so willing to report anything that they see out of the ordinary. Yet, when I look at the people in our country, with very few exceptions, I see people that are so consumed talking on their cell phones, responding to those ever-important messages on their BlackBerries, listening to iPods to the point that they're tuned out, watching big screens and so engrossed in sports that nothing else matters, that they pay very little attention to their surroundings. Now, Albert Einstein once said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I interpret what he said to include that trying to deal with different challenges and using the same old way of trying to accomplish them is just not going to work. The threat of terrorism cannot be dealt with using the traditional criminal justice methods of just catching the bad guys and locking them up. So let me ask you this. Does it make any difference if Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Latin Kings, M13, or some lone wolf sets off a dirty bomb in the middle of a major city, flies a plane into a building, discharges a biological weapon, or attacks one of our schools? No, the damage is done. Now, sure, we need to catch the offenders, but we just cannot allow it to happen. We must be more proactive. And as the old saying goes, we can't wait for the horses to run out of the barn before we lock the doors. Now, although the latest modern technology provides us with some wonderful tools, we cannot completely rely on it. And we absolutely must begin to better utilize our critical thinking skills, develop human intelligence, and become better observers, period. Because behind every piece of technology is a human being. And in every instance, a human will have to make a decision based on the information provided by the technology. Now, it's been said that we only use about 10% of our brain. But according to the most current scientific research, that is not true. We do use most of our brain for the numerous complex functions it performs. What is true is that we've only tapped a very small amount, about 1% of the potential of what our brains can achieve. So my goal today is hopefully to get you interested and to excite you about looking at some new ways of thinking and to encourage all of us to realize this potential to further develop our incredible brain power. Now, the research and personal observations that I've made over the past 4 years have absolutely convinced me that we can create incredibly more effective police officers, federal officers, military and security professionals through skill development and training if we will take the initiative, the time, and the expense to make this a priority. And I further believe that it would be the greatest return on investment that we could accomplish. And now is the time to achieve this. So today, I'd like to go over some basics with you. And we have a short time, and I've divided this webinar into sections. So hopefully you'll continue through each section, and I'll give you the cue as to when to do that. But here's what I'd like to cover. Situational awareness, instinct versus reasoning, what I call meeting your brain, rapid recognition. We're going to do some exercises, so please have a paper and pencil ready. The OODA loop, and then how to take the next steps. So let's start with situational awareness. Well, technically defined, situational awareness is the perception of an environmental elements within a volume of time and space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their status in the near future. But basically what that means is, what are you paying attention to? And more importantly, what are you not paying attention to? Situational awareness is a mindset, and it's the ability to frame what you're doing with having several frames of reference going on at the same time. Now, this last question in red is what I call personal red teaming. That is, thinking like a terrorist or thinking like a criminal as to what would they do in the situation that you might be in to cause harm or damage. So here are questions to ask yourself. Who poses a threat? What kinds of threats are there? Where could the threats exist? How could they happen? And most importantly, what can I do immediately if something is about to happen or does happen? Now, this is not paranoia. But what I'm talking about here is being able to sit comfortably in a restaurant, walk through a shopping mall, send a child to school, or stand in a public place with the ability to rapidly recognize potential threats and then be ready and able to react to them. Now, through our evolution, we've been given a survival mechanism that fortunately we rarely have to use. However, unfortunately, we've unlearned or dumbed down our ability to trust our instincts. Now, from a Darwinian perspective, it's a survival mechanism, or as author Gavin de Becker says, it's the gift of fear, or Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink explains it as thin slicing. Now, it's an instinctual older part of the brain that works sort of like an alarm system when we're in danger or a threat might exist. It's been called the sixth sense, the spidey sense, a gut feeling, or intuition, and it has often been thought of to be psychic phenomena, but that it is not. It is a very real brain function that uses all of our senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And of all these, vision in particular gives us about 80% of the information our brain receives. Now, it's important to note that although we believe we see with our eyes, we really see with our brain. So let me show you a couple examples. Now, our eyes see the picture, but our brain interprets what we see. So the more we can train our brain to see the actual stimuli as they really are, the more accurately the interpretation that we'll receive. So when you realize the trick to this illusion, you should be able to interpret both a lady and a skull. Now, your brain has the neural connections to switch back and forth between the two. Now, as I show you the next picture, what do you see? Do you see the naked rear end of a young girl standing on the bed? Or do you see the crease between the arm and the shoulder of the girl holding the camera? Now, here it doesn't make much difference. But in this slide, it can make a great deal of difference. And sometimes we see what we want to see, or what our mind is telling us we see, and this is called perceptual blindness. Here's where mistakes can be made, and even fatal mistakes. Now, the brain is the most complex mechanism in the universe, and scientists are just now beginning to understand partially how it works. In fact, many of the former beliefs of how the brain worked have been discarded and changed in the recent decades with some of the modern screening devices that can look into the brain, such as the fMRI and PET scans. Now, this is the stuff that I call rocket surgery. And over the past 4 years, I've been working with psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, and scientists even internationally. And they would take days, if not months, trying to explain this concept. But let me try to make it very simple. And pardon me if this sounds juvenile. As I said earlier, I am interested in creating performance-centric, not just academic rhetoric. So academics, please pardon me if this sounds oversimplified, and I truly understand that brain functions are incredibly complex, even so much that science continues to search for answers. But my goal is to make this simple to understand. So I've created some characters to represent different parts of the brain. So let me introduce them to you. Now, the first is called the professor. And the professor represents the frontal cortex, or the reasoning part of the brain. Now, the professor is responsible for reasoning, logical thinking, and our ability to think abstractly. Now, the second character actually represents billions of characters. And your brain has more of these characters than there are people on Earth. And I call him Johnny Neuron, or Johnny and the Neurons. He is the connector, or the messenger that sends electrochemical signals throughout the brain at lightning speed. And the neurons are like rabbits in that they continue to reproduce. But with mental exercise, they can increase, and in fact, with proper diet and nutrition, you can even make them stronger. Now, the last character, and the one that we're going to focus on, is Gunny the Drill Sergeant. Now, this character represents an older part of the brain that is sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain. Gunny, among other things like controlling your heartbeat, is responsible for your instincts, such as the fight-flight response. And he's able to interpret what you see thousands of times faster than the professor. But even though he will try and scream out commands, such as raising the hair on the back of your neck, he is often ignored, because the professor tries to overrule him with reasoning and logic. Now, I would like in the next part to describe a scenario to you of a real set of circumstances that happened to a police officer.